And with that said, I think it's really at that time to actually pass on to Professor David Gadd, who would then begin the introductions. They've got 20 seconds each to really introduce themselves, and then we'll get to the meat of the event for today as well. Okay, over to you, David.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. It's so wonderful to see so many people attending, and I'm really honoured to be able to share some thoughts with you. We have some serious problems to attend to, though. 1 in 13 women in the UK experience domestic abuse each year. 1 in 5 have been sexually assaulted as adults, and so few of those secure anything that looks like justice. My view is that this won't change unless we reduce the volume of gender-based abuse, and reducing the volume of gender-based abuse will require us to engage with the emotional attractions of violence and control to men. To be clear, I'm not giving credence to the crime of passion defense. I'm just as unconvinced, I'm sure most of you are, by the argument that some men kill their partners because they just snapped. But I do think we need to ask how it can seem reasonable for a man to physically punish his partner for being unable to curtail events outside of her control, or for simply speaking her mind. And we need to ask what this reveals about the emotional work men expect women to do for them in intimate relationships. What kinds of complex emotional labour is performed for men who purport to be in control before they lose control? Why do some men who are abusive seem to need their families much more than their families, children and partners need them? The answer we give to this question is misogyny or everyday sexism, which is right. But if we are going to respond effectively to those who have aligned themselves with the not all men hashtag, then we do have to ask why some men and not others become so invested in misogyny. What do they get from it? Well, older men are actually much more likely to endorse the more traditional patriarchal values than younger men, but rates of domestic abuse perpetration are higher amongst younger men, the group aged 15 to 25, many of whom would say that they support gender equality. My own research has shown that most young men, in fact, know that it is wrong to hit a partner, but some do evoke exceptions to this rule, typically when a partner has hit them first or when they suspect a partner has cheated on them. Most young men can understand how their own fears of betrayal generate controlling behaviour, which they construe as justifiable in some circumstances, even if they generally regard it as morally wrong. And such controlling behaviour inevitably often generates arguments in couples, which some men construe as fights, which they then presume they must always win. For me, this means we need to direct our attention to the contradictions in many men's attitudes towards domestic abuse and their willingness to excuse, in particular instances of violence, that which they would ordinarily condemn in the abstract. Most young men, and I would say quite a few older men, struggle to realise, to understand that controlling a partner actually increases their own feelings of insecurity in an intimate relationship. And some young men do have more reasons than others to struggle with trust. Those who've been serially let down by parents and professionals, who have lived in institutional care or been in prison as children, have reason to be distrusting. And some of those young men do come to invest in tough, I can look after myself variants of masculinity, which simultaneously render them both more prone to violence and more inclined to see themselves as nothing like the crazy madmen or racialized stereotypes of perpetrators that most attract media coverage. What can we do about this? Well, I want to suggest there are 3 things. First, we've come a really long way with preventative education in schools, but we are still missing some key parts of an effective strategy there. Most of our service provision is directed at adults, not teenagers, and most of our education stops at 16, when, as everyone invited is now reminding us, it needs to continue way into adulthood. Second, how we engage with young men really matters. Nowadays, most young people leave school knowing the different types of abuse, that it affects women most, but that some men are victims too. They spot, however, that PHSE is a non-examined subject. They spot also the tokenism when an LGBT vignette is thrown in after a couple of weeks on pregnancy. And if they are a young man living with a father who is abusive, they spot the problem with the violence against women and girls agenda that limits the degree to which they can legitimately identify with their mothers and sisters as victims of male violence, and which raises the suspicion that they may be as dangerous as their dads or stepdads. So we have a system in which many young men learn facts about domestic abuse, but which I think fails to interrogate with them the push and pulls of intimacy, or how it feels to be fearful, or to recognize that with intimacy comes vulnerability and a need to relinquish some control. We teach kids to ask for consent and that porn is bad, but we don't explore with young men what desire or enthusiasm might look like in their partners, or teach them to check out at a deeper level what their partners might want from a relationship. We can change this, but it will mean abandoning the macho discourse of teaching bad men a lesson, echoed in too many political responses, left and right, to the tragedy of femicide and sexual violence. What we need is proactive public engagement, not just public awareness campaigns, in which children and their teachers, grandfathers, fathers and sons, brothers and sisters, boyfriends and girlfriends can collectively acknowledge the emotional needs many men covet away by controlling their partners and by abusing women and children. This conversation, I conclude, needs to expose the emasculating weaknesses violence and abuse routinely conceal, as much as the power their enactment routinely entails. Thank you for listening to what I have had to say. Rather than delay further, I'm going to hand over to Darren Lavelle, who I believe is based in the West Midlands and is CEO of the Epiphany People Project. Thank you.